My name is Emma. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in healthcare administration. It's not the kind of job people romanticize. There's no applause for it. It's quiet, procedural, and often invisible, which I think is why people tend to underestimate me. If you ask the people around me to describe who I am, they'd probably say I'm reliable, calm, the one who has things handled. I don't raise my voice. I don't demand attention. I don't dramatize pain. I learned early that being composed makes others comfortable, and that comfort can sometimes erase you from the picture entirely. I've always been the daughter who didn't cause trouble, the one who stepped in without being asked, the one who noticed what needed to be paid, scheduled, covered, or smoothed over, and quietly did it. Not because I wanted praise, but because I believed responsibility was a form of love. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about yelling, cutting people off, or humiliating anyone. There are no villains here in the traditional sense. There are just choices, patterns, and consequences that unfold slowly, often so slowly that no one notices them until it's too late. For 8 years, I paid my parents' medical bills. I handled insurance calls, coordinated treatments, and absorbed the financial weight of illnesses that reshaped all our lives. I did it because I could, because someone had to, and because I thought protecting them was what family meant. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined at the time, was that I would eventually find out the truth in a lawyer's office, sitting 2 chairs away from the people I thought I was protecting. That moment didn't explode my life. It didn't break me. It clarified something I had been refusing to see. This is a story about quiet dominance, not the kind that conquers, but the kind that endures, about psychological reversal that doesn't announce itself, about how being underestimated can become a form of leverage if you're patient enough to understand it. As this unfolds, there will be long stretches where nothing dramatic seems to happen. Just small decisions, small silences, small shifts in how I listen, how I document, how I prepare. That's intentional, because real power changes hands long before anyone notices the room has gone quiet. I'm telling this now not to rewrite the past, but to tell it honestly, without embellishment, without rage, without pretending I was stronger than I was at the beginning, or weaker than I am now. If you've ever been the one holding everything together while everyone else assumed it would always be that way, you might recognize parts of yourself in this. So before we go any further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever wondered what would happen if you stopped being invisible? To my parents, I was the steady one. That was the word my mother used most often when talking about me to others. Not warm, not close, steady, as if I were a piece of furniture that didn't wobble. Something useful you leaned on without thinking about how long it had been holding the weight. My younger brother Daniel was different. He was expressive, charming, and visibly emotional, the kind of person whose stress announced itself. When he struggled, it was obvious. When he succeeded, it was celebrated. He needed support, and everyone could see why. I didn't seem to need anything. I lived nearby while Daniel moved out of state years earlier. I had a stable job in healthcare administration, the kind that doesn't make family members brag at dinners but does quietly pay the bills. I didn't talk much about work. I didn't talk much about myself at all. And because of that, an assumption settled in without anyone ever saying it out loud. Emma is fine. When my father was first diagnosed, I was the one who sat through the appointments. I took notes while my mother stared at the floor. I asked questions the doctor didn't volunteer. When the bills started coming in, confusing, coded, aggressive, I was the one who called the insurance company during my lunch breaks. At first, everyone thanked me, but gratitude has a short shelf life when reliability feels permanent. Over time, my role became fixed. I was the one who knew the passwords, the policy numbers, the follow-up dates. I was the one who picked up prescriptions when my parents were too tired. The one who quietly transferred money when something unexpected came up, which was often. No one asked how much it cost me, financially or otherwise. Not because they were cruel, but because I never made it visible. At family gatherings, conversations floated around me. My brother talked about his job stress, his rent, and his plans. My parents worried out loud about his future, his happiness. When I spoke, it was usually to answer a question. Practical, factual, short. I learned that if I stayed calm, things moved more smoothly. If I didn't complain, no one felt defensive. If I handled things quietly, no one panicked. So that's who I became, the daughter who didn't add to the burden. There's a strange kind of invisibility that comes with competence. When you do something well for long enough, people stop seeing the effort entirely. They only notice if it's missing. I didn't resent my family. Not then. I believed this was just how roles worked. Someone had to be the anchor. Someone had to be the adult in the room. And honestly, part of me was proud of it. I paid the medical bills not because I was asked, but because it felt unthinkable not to. I tracked everything in a slim black ledger. Dates, amounts, notes from calls. Because that's how my mind works. Order makes chaos survivable. That ledger wasn't a weapon. It wasn't leverage. It was reassurance. Proof that I had things under control. Or so I thought. What I didn't realize was that, in being so dependable, I had become easy to overlook. My presence was assumed, not acknowledged. My contributions were expected, not discussed. Decisions began happening around me instead of with me. And because I didn't object, no one checked. Looking back, there were moments, small, quiet moments, when I felt a flicker of something like displacement. A comment that landed oddly. A decision mentioned in passing. A tone shift when money came up. At the time, I brushed them aside. I told myself this was what maturity looked like. That love didn't need recognition. That family wasn't transactional. I told myself that being useful was enough. It took me years to understand that usefulness, without respect, is a fragile place to stand. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. That's the strange thing about the moments that matter most. They rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly, wrapped in ordinary conversation, disguised as something too small to react to without feeling dramatic. We were sitting at my parents' kitchen table, the same one I'd grown up doing homework at. My father had just come back from a follow-up appointment, and I was flipping through a folder of test results, organizing them into the order I liked. Chronological, clear, contained. My mother was talking about the house, not in a sentimental way, not in a someday way, just casually. The way people talk when they assume everyone present understands their place in the story. When all this settles, she said, stirring her tea, we'll need to make sure the house stays in the family. Daniel's been talking about wanting to come back. She didn't look at me when she said it. I remember pausing, my fingers still holding a page half-turned. It wasn't the content of the sentence that caught me. It was the assumption underneath it. The way the future had already been narrated, and I was listening to it like an audience member instead of a participant. That makes sense, I said eventually, because that was my default. Agreement as a lubricant. My father nodded. He's always loved this place. They continued talking, discussing hypothetical timelines and repairs, as if I weren't sitting there paying for the medications that made these conversations possible. I told myself I was overthinking it. After all, no decisions had been made, no documents signed. It was just talk. And families talk about things without meaning anything by it. Still, something about that moment lodged itself in me, not as anger, more like a thin, almost invisible line, a recognition that something had shifted by a fraction of an inch. A few weeks later, another small moment arrived. An insurance issue had come up, a billing error that required several calls, and eventually a lump sum payment to avoid penalties. I handled it the way I always did. I didn't announce it. I just transferred the money and noted it in my ledger. At dinner that weekend, my mother sighed and said, I don't know what we'd do without Emma. She's just good with this stuff. This time she smiled at me. Everyone nodded. My brother laughed lightly. Yeah, that's Emma. Always the responsible one. Responsible. Not generous. Not sacrificial. Not involved. Responsible sounded like an inherent trait, not a choice I was making every single day. Something in me wanted to say, "Do you know how much this costs? Do you know what I'm giving up to make this possible?" But the moment passed, and I stayed quiet. That was the cut. Not because anyone had insulted me, not because I was excluded outright, but because my role had been subtly reduced to a function, a background system that kept things running. And systems aren't consulted, they're relied upon. I started noticing how often decisions were referenced after the fact, how plans were described as already in motion, how my involvement was assumed, but my opinion wasn't requested. When my brother talked about moving back someday, it was discussed as an emotional need. When I talked about logistics, it was treated as a service. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even articulate the discomfort to myself fully. I told myself I was being sensitive, that stress made people careless with language, that love didn't always sound the way we expected it to. But that first small cut did something important. It taught me to pay attention. I began listening not just to what was said, but to what was assumed, to the invisible hierarchy forming without ceremony or malice. And for the first time, I realized something unsettling. They didn't see me as someone who might need consideration. They saw me as someone who would always provide it. At the time, I still believed that if I continued being steady, if I stayed generous, calm, useful, things would naturally balance out. I didn't yet understand that silence, once established, teaches people exactly how far they can go. After the first small cut, nothing dramatic happened. That's how disrespect survives. It blends into routine. It doesn't demand attention. It repeats itself just softly enough that you start questioning your own reaction to it. Life went on. Appointments, paperwork, work deadlines. My parents' health stabilized in a way that still required constant management, just less urgency, which meant fewer thank yous, fewer check-ins, fewer moments where my presence felt essential. Instead, it felt expected. My brother started calling more often. At first, I was relieved. I told myself it was good that he wanted to be involved again, that family responsibilities didn't need to be evenly split to be meaningful. But the calls followed a pattern. He'd talk about how stressed he was, how expensive his city was, how hard it was to plan a future when everything felt uncertain. My parents listened intently. They reassured him. They offered sympathy the way you offer a chair to someone who looks tired. When the conversation turned to practical matters, appointments, bills, insurance, it drifted back to me. "Emma's got that covered," my mother would say, and I did. What changed was that no one checked anymore. No one asked how it was covered, or whether I was still comfortable covering it. The assumption hardened into a norm. I remember one call in particular. My brother was venting about money, and my father said, almost reflexively, "Well, at least Emma's stable. She'll be okay." It wasn't said unkindly. It was said with relief. And that's when I realized something uncomfortable. My stability was being used to absorb everyone else's instability. I started adjusting my own expectations to fit the role. I didn't mention when my own expenses increased. I didn't talk about the promotion I turned down because it required relocating. I didn't talk about the weekends I spent on the phone with providers instead of resting. I told myself that fairness wasn't the point, that love didn't need a ledger. Even as I kept one, the disrespect didn't come in the form of insults or raised voices. It came in omissions. In the way my presence was assumed but not acknowledged. In the way future plans were spoken aloud without once asking where I fit into them. At one point, my mother mentioned, almost offhand, that they'd been talking to Daniel about long-term arrangements. She didn't elaborate. I didn't ask. I could feel a question forming in my throat. A reasonable one. A calm one. But I swallowed it, because asking would disrupt the equilibrium. And I had trained myself to value smoothness over clarity. The more I normalized these moments, the more invisible they became, to everyone but me. And even I started to doubt myself. I would replay conversations in my head, trying to determine whether I was imagining the slight, whether my expectations were unrealistic, whether wanting acknowledgement made my help less pure somehow. I thought of all the stories about selfless daughters, about quiet strength, about not keeping score, so I stopped seeing the pattern for what it was. Or rather, I saw it, but I explained it away. That's the danger of being the reliable one. You start believing that asking for space, recognition, or inclusion is a failure on your part. A crack in the image you've carefully maintained. Meanwhile, the role continues to calcify. I noticed that when my brother suggested ideas, moving back, renovating, helping out more, they were treated as intentions full of promise. When I offered suggestions, they were treated as implementation details. I was no longer a voice in the room. I was infrastructure. And infrastructure doesn't get thanked until it breaks. The normalization didn't hurt all at once. It wore me down gradually, like water on stone. Each moment is small enough to ignore. Together, heavy. I stayed quiet because that's what I had always done. Because it felt safer than confronting something I didn't fully understand yet. But somewhere beneath that silence, something else was happening. Not anger, awareness. I was starting to understand that the role I'd accepted was costing me more than I'd admitted, and that no one was going to notice, unless I made a different choice. At the time, I didn't know what that choice would be. I just knew that continuing as I was would eventually leave me with nothing but receipts and regrets. There's a moment when you stop pretending a pattern is accidental. For me, it didn't come with a confrontation or a revelation. It came with a quiet certainty, the kind that settles in your chest and refuses to be talked away. I wasn't becoming invisible. I had already been assigned that role. It was subtle, the way roles always are. No one sat me down and explained it. No one said, "You handle the hard parts so the rest of us don't have to." It emerged through repetition, through who was consulted and who wasn't, through whose feelings were handled delicately, and whose were assumed to be resilient. I was the reliable daughter, the capable one, the one who didn't need reassurance. And because I didn't push back, that identity solidified. I saw it clearly one afternoon when my mother mentioned, almost cheerfully, that she and my father had been discussing the future with Daniel again. "He's got ideas," she said, "about the house, about how things could work if he comes back." She was folding laundry as she spoke. I was sitting at the table, laptop open, reviewing insurance statements. "What kind of ideas?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Oh, nothing final," she said quickly. "Just talking." Talking. Again. "And I'm part of that conversation?" I asked. She paused. Just for a second, long enough for the answer to arrive before the words did. "Well," she said slowly, "you're so practical. We figured you'd be fine with whatever makes the most sense." That was it. Not malicious, not cruel, but definitive. My role wasn't to be consulted. It was to adapt, to smooth over whatever decisions others felt entitled to make. I nodded, closed my laptop, and something inside me went very still. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't even disappointment. It was clarity. I realized that in their minds, I was no longer a stakeholder. I was a stabilizer. Someone whose needs were flexible, whose life could bend around the needs of others because it always had. And the most uncomfortable part was this. I had helped teach them that. Every time I absorbed inconvenience without comment. Every time I paid without discussion. Every time I chose peace over presence. I thought of all the times I'd been described as low maintenance. As if that were a compliment. Low maintenance people are easy to overlook. Easy to schedule around. Easy to exclude, not out of spite, but out of habit. I started noticing how my parents' language shifted when they talked about Daniel versus when they talked about me. Daniel needed support. He was trying. He was figuring things out. I was fine. I was solid. I was good at this stuff. No one worried about my future. No one asked what I wanted. Because I hadn't trained them to. That afternoon, after I left my parents' house, I sat in my car for a long time without turning the key. I stared at the steering wheel and felt something like grief, but not for what had happened, for what had never been offered. I didn't confront them. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood something important. Confrontation wouldn't change the role I'd already been placed in. It would only create defensiveness, and defensiveness would make me look unreasonable. Instead, I did something quieter. I started paying attention, not to their words, but to the structure of how decisions were being made. Who initiated them? Who finalized them? Who was informed after the fact? And where I sat in that flow, I was useful. trusted, depended on, but I was not considered. That distinction mattered more than I'd ever admitted. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask a question I'd avoided for years. If this role never changed, what would be left of me? I didn't have an answer yet, but I knew I couldn't keep pretending the role was accidental. Because once you see the shape of the box you've been placed in, staying inside it becomes a choice. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no raised voices, no moment where someone said the wrong thing and shattered the illusion. If you had asked anyone else in my family about that day later, they probably wouldn't remember it at all. But I do. It was a Tuesday. Ordinary in every way. I had taken the morning off work to accompany my father to a routine follow-up appointment. His health was stable, which meant the visit felt procedural rather than urgent. We sat in the waiting room, the air faintly smelling of disinfectant and old magazines, and made small talk about traffic and weather. At one point, my father leaned back in his chair and said, almost casually, "Your brother called last night. He's thinking more seriously about coming back." I nodded. "You've mentioned that. He's been under a lot of pressure," my father continued. "I worry about him." I didn't respond right away. Not because I disagreed, but because something about the phrasing caught my attention. The ease with which worry flowed in one direction. After the appointment, we stopped for coffee. My father paid, then paused, frowning slightly. "Actually," he said, "do you mind covering this? I left my wallet in the car." Of course, I said yes. I always said yes. We sat by the window, cups between us. And as we talked, he mentioned, again, without drama, that he and my mother were planning to meet with a lawyer soon, just to get things in order. "Nothing to worry about. Daniel should probably be there," he added. "He has strong feelings about the house." I looked at him then, really looked, not at his face, but at the assumption beneath his words. "And me?" I asked. He blinked, just once. A small pause. "Well," he said slowly, "you're good with details. We figured you'd understand whatever we decide." There it was again. That familiar sentence, dressed up as trust. I felt something click, not loudly but decisively, like a door closing somewhere inside me. In that moment, I understood that nothing was going to change on its own. Not because my parents didn't care, but because the system we'd built worked too well for everyone except me. I finished my coffee, smiled, changed the subject. But internally, something had shifted from endurance to intention. For the first time, I stopped asking myself why this was happening and started asking what it meant. It meant that my silence had been interpreted as consent, that my reliability had been mistaken for endless availability, that my emotional restraint had been read as a lack of need, and most importantly, it meant that if I continued as I was, the future would unfold without me. Not because I was excluded, but because I had removed myself by never stepping forward. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me calm in a way I hadn't been before. Not the calm of accommodation, but the calm of clarity. That afternoon, when I got home, I opened my ledger, the same one I'd been keeping for years. I didn't add anything new. I just read dates, amounts, notes in my own handwriting. 8 years of quiet support, documented without emotion. For the first time, I didn't see it as reassurance. I saw it as information. And information I knew changed things. I didn't make a plan that day. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even tell myself what I was going to do differently. I just stopped telling myself that nothing could be done. That was the shift. Not outward, inward. The moment I accepted that silence was no longer just something that happened to me. It was something I could choose how to use. After that day, nothing changed on the surface. And that was intentional. I still answered calls, still attended appointments, still paid bills when they came due. If anyone had been watching closely, which they weren't, they might have noticed that I spoke less, that I volunteered less information, that I stopped filling conversational gaps with reassurance. But because I had always been quiet, the change blended seamlessly into who they already believed me to be. Silence had always been my default. Now, it has become a decision. I stopped explaining my thought process, stopped offering suggestions unless directly asked, stopped anticipating needs that hadn't been expressed. Not out of spite, out of observation. I wanted to see what happened when I stopped smoothing the path ahead of everyone else. At first, nothing noticeable occurred, which only confirmed what I was learning. My effort had been invisible long before I withdrew any of it. Conversations continued as usual. Plans were discussed. Assumptions were made. My brother spoke confidently about the future as if it were something waiting for him, already prepared. And I listened. Listening, I realized, gave me access to something I'd been missing. Unfiltered information. When people think you are agreeable, they are careless with their honesty. I heard how often decisions were framed as conclusions rather than discussions. How frequently my involvement was treated as logistical, not relational. How rarely anyone wondered aloud what I might want. And I also noticed something else. The more I stopped volunteering, the more people filled the space with their own priorities. My brother talked more. My parents planned more. And in those plans, my role became even clearer. Supportive, adaptable, uncomplaining. It would have been easy to interrupt, to assert myself, to demand inclusion. But I understood now that confrontation would only address the surface. It wouldn't change the underlying structure that had been years in the making. So I stayed quiet, but not passive. I began paying closer attention to timing, language, and tone. I noted when conversations happened without me. I observed which details were shared freely and which were withheld. I asked questions that sounded harmless but revealed a lot. When are you thinking of doing that? Who suggested this? Have you already talked to someone about it? I never challenged the answers. I just collected them. At work, I had learned that systems don't collapse because of emotion. They shift because of data. Because someone understands the flow well enough to know where to apply pressure or where to remove support. At home, I was finally seeing the system clearly. Silence, I discovered, made people assume agreement. The agreement made them comfortable enough to proceed without scrutiny. That comfort would matter later. Emotionally, this phase was quieter than anything that came before. There was no internal debate, no nightly rehearsals of conversations that would never happen. I felt strangely grounded, detached but not numb. It wasn't that I cared less, it was that I cared differently. I stopped measuring my worth by how much I could absorb, stopped equating love with endurance. Instead, I focused on understanding the full picture, financially, legally, relationally. And I did something else, something subtle but important. I stopped justifying their behavior to myself. I didn't excuse it as stress, or oversight, or tradition. I didn't label it as cruelty either. I simply accepted it as reality. They were moving forward with a future that assumed my continued support without my continued input. And because I wasn't protesting, they believed that the future was secure. That belief was a gift. It gave me time to think. Time to prepare. Time to decide what I was and wasn't willing to carry into the next chapter of my life. Silence, when chosen consciously, is not weakness. It's positioning. And I was positioning myself quietly, while everyone else mistook my stillness for stability. Preparation doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like patience. From the outside, my life looked unchanged. Same job. Same routines. Same quiet presence at family gatherings. If anything, I seemed even easier, less opinionated, less involved in discussions that didn't require my input. What no one noticed was that I had shifted from participating to observing. An observation, when done carefully, reveals patterns most people never realize they're repeating. I began with the practical side, because that's where I felt most grounded. I reviewed every financial contribution I'd made over the years, not emotionally, but analytically. Medical payments, insurance gaps, emergency transfers. The total wasn't something I calculated all at once. I didn't need the shock of a single number. What mattered more was the consistency. 8 years of uninterrupted support. Predictable. Reliable. Documented. I didn't do this to prove anything to anyone else. I did it to understand my own position clearly, to stop minimizing it in my own mind. At the same time, I started learning. Not frantically, not obsessively, but deliberately. I read about estate planning, about family property arrangements, about how informal assumptions can harden into legal realities if no one questions them. I didn't assume the worst. I assumed complexity. And complexity, I knew how to navigate. At work, I was used to systems where decisions made early quietly determined outcomes much later, where the absence of a question mattered as much as the presence of an answer. So I asked myself questions I'd never allowed before. What if the future that they were planning didn't include me at all? What if my contributions were seen as help, not investment? What if fairness wasn't part of the framework they were using? These weren't accusations, they were scenarios. And scenarios require preparation. I began keeping a second set of notes, not in my ledger, but in a separate file. Dates of conversations, phrases that stood out, mentions of lawyers, timelines, and intentions. Nothing dramatic, nothing incriminating, just context. I also started noticing how often people confuse presence with power. My brother talked confidently about coming back, about making things work, about how much he cared. But his involvement was theoretical, emotional, future-oriented. Mine was concrete, ongoing, already spent. Yet when plans were discussed, his voice carried weight because it carried desire. Mine faded into the background because it carried responsibility. Understanding that difference was crucial. Desire is loud. Responsibility is quiet. And in most families, loud things feel more real. I didn't try to make myself louder. I did something more effective. I became precise. I stopped rounding numbers in my head. Stopped using vague language, even internally. I stopped thinking of my role as helping out and started recognizing it as sustaining. And sustainment creates dependency, whether acknowledged or not. They never noticed that I stopped offering reassurance about the future. That I no longer said, "We'll figure it out," or "It'll be fine." I let those phrases hang unanswered. Someone else always filled the gap. They never noticed that I asked more questions about the process than the outcome. About who was involved. About what had already been decided. They never noticed that I began speaking less about what I felt and more about what existed in concrete terms. They never noticed that I was preparing because preparation, when done well, doesn't disturb the surface. Emotionally, this period felt almost peaceful, because nothing hurt, but because I was no longer confused. Confusion is exhausting. Clarity, even painful clarity, creates stillness. I accepted that my family wasn't acting out of malice. They were acting out of habit, out of a narrative that placed me in a supportive role, and never questioned whether that role came with rights. And I accepted something else too. If I wanted a different outcome, it wouldn't come from being seen differently. It would come from acting differently, at the right moment, with the right information. That moment hadn't arrived yet, so I waited, not passively, strategically. They continued planning, speaking freely, assuming continuity. They felt secure because nothing about me signaled disruption. That security was built on a misunderstanding. They believed my silence meant acceptance. What it really meant was readiness. The truth didn't arrive with drama. There was no gasp, no racing heartbeat, no moment where I had to sit down because the room felt unsteady. When the realization finally settled, it did so quietly, like a document sliding across a desk, waiting for me to read it. It happened on an evening that felt almost too ordinary to matter. I was at home, laptop open, papers spread neatly across the table. I had been reviewing notes from a recent conversation my mother mentioned in passing, something about getting advice and making sure everything was clear. The words themselves weren't alarming. What caught my attention was how often clarity was being discussed without me present. So I did what I had learned to do best. I traced the structure. I revisited the timeline of conversations, compared phrasing, noted who was present and who wasn't. I looked at what had been framed as planning versus what had been framed as deciding. And slowly, unmistakably, a pattern emerged. They weren't preparing options. They were finalizing assumptions. The house, my parents' house, had already been mentally assigned. Not because paperwork had been signed yet, but because emotionally, the decision felt complete to them. Daniel was the future occupant, the one whose life would be helped by it, the one whose needs were seen as ongoing. My role in that future was functional, not foundational. I wasn't being positioned as someone with a claim. I was being positioned as someone who would understand not having one. That was the reveal, not a betrayal in the dramatic sense. Something quieter, more structural. I realized that my years of financial support were not being counted as a contribution towards shared security. They were being categorized as help freely given, help that didn't alter ownership, authority, or entitlement. I sat with that understanding longer than I expected, not because it shocked me, but because it clarified everything that had felt ambiguous before. All the moments I'd questioned, all the conversations seemed slightly misaligned. They suddenly made sense, and clarity has a strange emotional effect. It strips away hope you didn't realize you were still carrying. I didn't cry. I did not feel angry. What I felt was something closer to relief, because now I knew where I stood, and more importantly, I knew where I didn't. I looked again at my ledger, at the careful documentation I'd kept without ever imagining it might matter beyond reassurance. I thought about the skills I used every day at work, how systems respond when a key support quietly changes position. And for the first time, I allowed myself to see leverage where I'd once only seen obligation. Not leverage to punish, leverage to choose. I realized that everything they were counting on, stability, continuity, smooth transition, depended on one assumption, that I would continue exactly as I had, without question, without pause, without redefining my role. They believed my silence meant permanence, but silence doesn't promise anything. It only delays disclosure. That night, I didn't make a dramatic decision. I didn't draft ultimatums or rehearse speeches. I simply acknowledged the truth, fully and without justification. I was not being included because inclusion was never part of the plan. And because of that, I was no longer obligated to protect a future that didn't protect me. That understanding didn't harden me, it steadied me. I closed my laptop, put the papers away, and for the first time in years I slept deeply. Because when you finally see the shape of the game you're in, you stop playing blindly. And blind loyalty, I understood now, had been the most expensive thing I'd ever given. Knowing the truth didn't force an immediate decision. That surprised me. I had always imagined that clarity would come with urgency, that once I knew, I would have to act, choose sides, draw lines, say something that couldn't be taken back. But the opposite happened. Clarity gave me space. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to confusion or doubt. I was standing on solid ground, looking at options that had always existed but never felt available to me. I saw 3 paths clearly. The first was the one I had been on all along. Continue quietly, accept the outcome, absorb the disappointment privately, and tell myself that love meant sacrifice without expectation. I could keep paying, keep supporting, keep smoothing the future for everyone else, and then adjust my own life around whatever was left. That path was familiar, predictable, and now that I saw it clearly, unbearably small. The second option was confrontation. I could sit my parents down, lay out the facts, ask the hard questions, demand recognition, inclusion, and fairness. I could point to the years of support, the financial reality, the imbalance. That path would be loud, emotional, uncomfortable, and it would almost certainly change how they saw me, not necessarily for the better. I knew enough about family dynamics to understand what confrontation would trigger: defensiveness, guilt, and reframing. My support would suddenly be scrutinized, motives questioned. Emotions are centered instead of structure. The conversation would become about feelings, not systems, and systems were where the real issue lived. The third option was quieter. It involved no speeches, no accusations, no attempts to be understood. It involved boundaries, not announced boundaries, enforced ones. I could change my behavior without explaining it, adjust my support without dramatizing it, step out of a role that had never been formally assigned, but had been firmly expected. This option was irreversible, not because it was cruel, but because once you stop propping up an assumption, the structure built on it has to recalibrate. I sat with these options for days, not weighing which one felt most justified, but which one aligned with the person I was becoming. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to teach anyone a lesson. I didn't want to be seen as the difficult daughter or the ungrateful one. What I wanted was agency. I wanted my life to stop being organized around other people's comfort. The quiet option required patience. It required restraint. It required trusting that I didn't need permission to change my role. And it required accepting that others might not understand, or might understand too late. That was the hardest part. Letting go of the need to be seen as reasonable. I thought about all the years I had been reasonable. All the times I had chosen silence to keep the peace. All the times I had absorbed cost, emotional and financial, so no one else had to feel discomfort. That reasonableness hadn't protected me. It had erased me, so I chose the third path. Not dramatically, not with a declaration. I chose it internally, with a calm certainty that didn't require validation. I decided that my support would no longer be automatic, that my resources, time, money, emotional energy, would be allocated intentionally, not assumed. I decided that I would no longer participate in futures where I had no place. This wasn't punishment, it was alignment. Once that decision was made, everything else became procedural. And procedure, I knew, was where I was strongest. Once the decision was made, there was no rush. That was the advantage of choosing a quiet path. Nothing needed to happen all at once. There was no moment that would be pointed to later as the day everything changed. Change would happen gradually, almost invisibly, the same way my support always had. I started with the simplest adjustment. I stopped anticipating. When medical bills arrived, I didn't pay them immediately. Not out of spite, but out of realism. I waited until someone asked. When appointment scheduling came up, I didn't automatically rearrange my work calendar. I asked what days were being considered. Sometimes I wasn't available. Each of these moments was small enough to seem insignificant. Easy to explain. Easy to dismiss. But together, they altered the rhythm everyone had grown used to. I also began separating what was urgent from what was merely convenient. True emergencies, I still handled. That was part of my moral code. But routine expenses, things that had quietly defaulted to me, I started redirecting. Let me know what the plan is, I'd say. Have you checked with insurance yet? What's the timeline on that? I didn't offer solutions unless asked directly. And when I was asked, I answered precisely, without cushioning, without volunteering to take it on myself. At the same time, I made my own life less flexible. I committed to work projects that required firm schedules. I took a short course I'd been postponing for years. I filled my weekends with things that mattered to me, not because I needed an excuse, but because I finally allowed myself to take up space in my own calendar. No one objected. That was telling. People only push back when they believe something belongs to them. My time, it turned out, had always been borrowed, not claimed. Financially, I became exact. I didn't announce changes. I simply stopped smoothing over gaps. When costs came up, I asked how they were being handled. When assumptions surfaced, I let them sit unanswered. My parents didn't panic. Not yet. Because from their perspective, nothing had broken. Things were just slightly less seamless, slightly slower, slightly more complicated. And complication, when it arrives gradually, doesn't trigger an alarm. I also stopped participating in conversations about the future that didn't include me meaningfully. When the house came up, I listened without comment. When my brother talked about plans, I didn't affirm or contradict them. I let silence do its quiet work. Behind the scenes, I handled what needed to be handled, on my terms. I organized my finances. I documented boundaries, not for legal reasons yet, but for clarity. I made sure that my choices were reversible for me, even if they weren't for anyone else. This wasn't withdrawal, it was recalibration. What surprised me most was how quickly others adapted, without noticing that they were adapting. They started making contingency plans, talking through logistics out loud, asking questions they'd never needed to ask before. The system was adjusting. Still, no one connected it to me. And that was the point. If I had announced my boundaries, they would have been debated, negotiated, emotionally processed. By moving in silence, I allowed reality to speak for itself. And reality doesn't argue. It simply changes what's possible. By the time anyone realized something fundamental had shifted, the shift was already embedded. Too many new habits formed. Too many assumptions quietly dismantled. The support they relied on was no longer guaranteed. And yet, Because there had been no confrontation, no accusation, no scene, no one could point to a moment when I had done something wrong. I had simply stopped doing what was never promised. That's the power of quiet movement. It doesn't demand acknowledgement. It just redraws the map. The first signs of strain appeared slowly, not as anger, not as the confrontation, but as confusion. A bill arrived that hadn't been paid yet. An appointment wasn't scheduled on time. A prescription refill took longer than expected. Small disruptions, nothing catastrophic, just enough to unsettle the rhythm they'd grown used to. My mother started calling more frequently, not to accuse, to clarify. Did you see the statement from the clinic? Do you know when the next payment is due? I thought this was already taken care of. Each question carried the same quiet assumption that somewhere along the line, something had gone wrong, that a system had failed. What she didn't consider was that the system had changed. I answered calmly, factually. Yes, I saw it. No, I haven't handled that yet. I wasn't sure what the plan was, so I didn't move forward. There was always a pause after those responses, just long enough for recalibration. At first, they adjusted by filling in the gaps themselves. My father made calls. My mother tracked dates. My brother offered suggestions from a distance, ideas rather than action. And still, no one confronted me, because nothing I was doing violated any agreement. There had never been an agreement. The discomfort deepened when money came up more directly. One evening, my mother mentioned, carefully, that expenses felt heavier lately, that things were adding up faster than expected. I thought we were doing okay, she said. We've always managed. I nodded. Managing takes coordination. Another pause. That was when the tone shifted, not to accusation, but to unease. They were beginning to feel the weight they hadn't realized I'd been carrying. My brother noticed it next. He started asking more detailed questions. Not about my parents' health, but about logistics. About how things were usually handled. About what he might need to do if he moved back sooner rather than later. For the first time, his plans encountered friction. I didn't block him. I didn't challenge him. I simply didn't clear the path. When he suggested timelines, I asked how he planned to support them. When he talked about the house, I asked what arrangements had been discussed formally. These weren't traps. They were reasonable questions, but they landed differently now, because no one had prepared answers. The family dynamic shifted in subtle ways. Conversations became more cautious. Decisions took longer. Uncertainty crept into places that had once felt stable. And still, no one named the cause. That's the thing about consequences when they arrive quietly. They feel like bad luck, like miscommunication, like a temporary inconvenience, not like the result of a long-standing imbalance. I could feel the tension growing, not as hostility, but as a low-level anxiety. They were adjusting to a reality where support wasn't automatic, where systems required effort, and where assumptions needed confirmation. And for the first time, I was not the buffer absorbing that discomfort. I watched them navigate it without stepping in. Not because I didn't care, but because stepping in would have restored the illusion that nothing had changed. And something had changed. They began to realize, slowly, that their plans depended on variables they didn't control. That the future they'd spoken about so confidently required cooperation, not just intention. The house, the finances, the care, it all required coordination. And coordination requires consent. That realization didn't land all at once. It seeped in through unanswered questions and delayed resolutions. By the time they sensed something fundamental was different, they still couldn't point to a single cause. All they knew was that the ground felt less solid than it used to, and I was no longer quietly reinforcing it. The panic didn't arrive loudly. It crept in disguised as urgency. It started with my mother calling twice in one afternoon. Then again the next morning. Her voice was still calm, but the pauses were longer now, the sentences less certain. "We might need to talk," she said one evening, "about everything." Everything was a word my family rarely used. It implied a mess, overlap, things that couldn't be handled quietly. I agreed to come by. When I walked into their house, nothing looked different. The same furniture, the same framed photos, the same sense of familiarity that had once felt grounding now felt strangely distant. They sat across from me at the table, both of them more serious than usual. "We didn't realize how much you were handling," my father said carefully. "Not fully." There it was. Not an apology, a realization. My mother reached for her tea and didn't drink it. We may have assumed too much. I listened without interrupting. They talked about stress, about feeling overwhelmed, about how complicated things had become recently, about how Daniel's timeline was uncertain, about how costs were adding up faster than expected. They talked for a long time. What they didn't talk about was the future they had already outlined without me. Not yet. Eventually, my mother looked at me and said, "We should have included you more." Should have. Past tense. I nodded. Not to forgive, not to agree, just to acknowledge that I'd heard her. They seemed relieved by that nod, as if it signaled a return to normal. As if this conversation were the beginning of a repair. But repairs only work when the structure is still flexible. This one wasn't. They began suggesting adjustments. Small ones at first. Maybe we could all sit down with the lawyer together. Maybe things could be reconsidered. Maybe nothing had to be decided right away. The urgency in their voices grew when they realized I wasn't responding the way I used to. I didn't reassure them. I didn't say it would be fine. I didn't say we'd figure it out. I asked one question. What exactly are you trying to fix? The room went quiet, because that question required specificity. And specificity revealed the problem. They weren't trying to fix a misunderstanding. They were trying to restore a system that no longer worked without my silent participation. My father sighed. We didn't mean for you to feel sidelined. I met his eyes. I didn't feel sidelined. I was sidelined. There was no heat in my voice. No accusation. Just a fact. That was when the panic sharpened. My mother's voice wavered. But you've always been part of this. I shook my head gently. I've been part of the work, not the decisions. That distinction landed hard. They started backtracking, reframing past conversations, emphasizing intentions, highlighting love. All the things people reach for when they realize they may have miscalculated. But intention doesn't undo structure, and love doesn't replace equity. I could see them trying to figure out how to bring me back into alignment without disrupting the plans already in motion. How to adjust just enough to regain stability. But it was too late for that. Not because I wanted it to be. Because the future they'd planned required a version of me that no longer existed. The daughter who would quietly absorb imbalance. Who would make things work regardless of personal cost. Who would accept exclusion as long as things stayed peaceful. That version of me had stepped out of the system weeks ago. They asked what I wanted. It was the first time they'd asked directly. And I realized something important in that moment. I didn't want to negotiate my worth retroactively. I didn't want inclusion as a response to inconvenience. I wanted a life that didn't require me to disappear to function. So I answered honestly, I want clarity, and I want autonomy. And I'm not willing to return to the old arrangement. There was nothing to argue with in that statement. They were quiet for the long time. Because by then, they understood, not just emotionally, but practically. The assumptions they'd built their plans on were gone, and no amount of regret could put them back. The actual confrontation, if it can even be called that, was quieter than anyone would expect. No raised voices, no tears, no dramatic exits. Just clarity, spoken calmly, without ornament. A few days after that conversation, we met again. This time with my brother present. He had flown in quickly, the urgency of the situation finally reaching him in a way that abstract discussions never had. We sat in a small conference room at a lawyer's office. Neutral walls, neutral table, neutral lighting. A place designed to remove emotion from decisions. I remember noticing the chairs. There were 4 of them. I was sitting 2 chairs away from the people I thought I was protecting. That detail stayed with me. The lawyer explained the basics. Estate planning. Options. Intentions. Nothing had been finalized yet, but the direction was clear. The house was meant to stay simple. To avoid conflict. To help the child who needed it most. Daniel nodded as if this had already been discussed. Which, of course, it had. Not with me. When the lawyer turned to me and asked if I had questions, everyone looked relieved. As if this was the moment where I'd either consent or complicate things. I asked one question. How are past contributions being considered? The room shifted. The lawyer looked at my parents. My parents looked at Daniel. Daniel looked surprised. Not offended. Just unprepared. What contributions? He asked. I didn't look at him. I looked at the lawyer. For 8 years, I said evenly. I've covered the majority of medical expenses. Insurance gaps, emergency payments, ongoing costs. I have records. I didn't slide anything across the table. I didn't need to. The fact that I could was enough. My parents tried to soften it. Emma was helping, my mother said quickly. Out of love. I nodded. Yes, I was. The lawyer asked a few neutral follow-up questions. Dates, general amounts, context. Daniel grew quiet, not defensive, not angry, just silent. Because silence is what happens when the story you've been living in suddenly expands. I didn't argue for the house. I didn't demand a share. I didn't accuse anyone of bad faith. I simply stated something that had never been said out loud before. My support was not incidental. It was foundational. And I'm no longer willing to participate in arrangements that treat it as invisible. That was it. No ultimatum, no emotional appeal. Just a boundary, stated clearly, in a room designed for clarity. The lawyer suggested taking time, reevaluating, considering all parties' positions. Everyone agreed. On the way out, my brother walked beside me in silence. At the door, he finally spoke. I didn't know, he said. I know, I replied. And I meant it. That was the moment I understood that the confrontation wasn't about blame. It was about reality finally entering the room. Later, my parents tried again to explain, to apologize, to frame things as oversight rather than exclusion. I listened, but I didn't soften my position, because calm doesn't mean flexible. It means resolved. I wasn't asking to be rescued, or compensated emotionally, or placed back into a role that no longer fit. I was asking for recognition of truth, and the freedom to choose my future without being bound to assumptions I never agreed to. That conversation didn't fix everything, but it did something more important. It ended the illusion that I could be overlooked without consequence, and it did so without heat, without damage, without me having to become someone louder, harsher, or harder than I actually am. After that meeting, things didn't snap neatly into place. They softened, shifted, rearranged themselves slowly, the way lives do when an old gravity no longer holds. I didn't walk away from my family. I didn't cut contact or issue ultimatums. I also didn't step back into the role I had outgrown. Instead, I occupied a new position, one that felt unfamiliar at first, but unmistakably mine. I became specific about my time, about my money, about my availability. Not defensively, just clearly. When my parents needed help, we talked about it openly. What was needed, who was responsible, and how it would be handled. Sometimes I participated, sometimes I didn't. And for the first time, those decisions didn't require justification. They were mine to make. The house was no longer discussed casually. The future was no longer spoken about as if it were settled. Plans became provisional, careful, and more honest. That was uncomfortable for everyone, but discomfort, I learned, is often the cost of fairness. My relationship with my brother changed too. Not dramatically, subtly. He became more attentive, asked more questions, listened more than he spoke. We weren't suddenly close, but we were clearer with each other. And clarity, it turns out, creates a different kind of respect. As for me, something fundamental shifted internally. I stopped measuring my value by how indispensable I was. I stopped equating love with endurance. I allowed myself to be a person with limits, preferences, and a future that didn't orbit around crisis management. I still care, deeply. But care no longer means self-erasure. I've learned that quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about self-possession. About knowing when to speak and when to let reality speak for you. About understanding that strength doesn't need to announce itself to be effective. I didn't win anything in the traditional sense. There was no triumphant ending. No moment where everyone applauded my restraint or acknowledged my sacrifice in exactly the way I once wished they would. And that's okay, because the reward wasn't recognition. It was alignment. My life feels proportional now. My energy goes where it's chosen, not assumed. My silence is no longer misread as consent. It's understood as consideration. And perhaps most importantly, I trust myself. I trust that I don't need to disappear to keep the peace. That I don't need to be endlessly reasonable to be loved. That being calm doesn't mean being passive. Who I am now is someone who can stand in a room, any room, without shrinking or hardening. Someone who knows that fairness doesn't require drama, only clarity. When I look back now, what surprises me most isn't what my family did. It's how long I believed that being invisible was the same thing as being good. I used to think love was proven through endurance, through how much you could carry without asking anyone else to notice. I thought that if I stayed calm enough, reliable enough, self-contained enough, things would naturally balance out in the end. They don't. Balance doesn't appear on its own. It has to be built, and sometimes rebuilt, by someone willing to stop absorbing weight silently. This story isn't about villains. My parents weren't malicious. My brother wasn't scheming. They were acting inside a system that worked for them because I made it work. And as long as I didn't question it, there was no reason for them to. That's the part we don't like to admit. Sometimes people don't take advantage because they're cruel. Sometimes they do it because the structure allows it. And silence, when it goes on long enough, becomes part of that structure. I didn't reclaim my life through confrontation. I didn't need to explode to be heard. I didn't have to humiliate anyone or burn bridges to stand up for myself. I simply stopped participating in arrangements that required me to disappear. That choice didn't make me cold. It made me honest. There's a quiet kind of power in refusing to explain yourself past the truth. In letting actions replace arguments. In understanding that you don't need permission to change roles you never agreed to in the first place. If there's one thing I hope this story leaves you with, it's this. Being dependable is not the same as being disposable. Being calm is not the same as being consenting. And being silent does not mean you owe anyone permanence. Sometimes the most dignified form of self-respect is stepping back. Not loudly, not angrily, but firmly enough that reality has to adjust. I don't regret helping my parents. I don't regret the years I gave. What I regret is how long it took me to believe that my presence deserved the same consideration as my effort. And if you're listening to this as someone who's always fine, always handled, always the strong one, I want you to know something. You're allowed to change the terms. You're allowed to choose yourself without becoming someone you don't recognize. Quiet dominance isn't about winning. It's about no longer losing yourself. So I'll leave you with this question. And I'd genuinely love to read your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever realized that the role you were praised for was the same role that kept you invisible? And if so, what would it look like to step out of it calmly on your own terms?
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye!